The first thing that made me take it seriously was a freezer inventory. Not the news. Not the videos people were trading around on their phones. Not even the first closures. It was a spreadsheet attached to an email at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning, listing frozen poultry, canned vegetables, powdered eggs, institutional oatmeal, and 600 pounds of rice that had been ordered for a state facility that had been officially closed for almost 4 years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee I had not yet sweetened, looking at that inventory line by line while the sun came through the blinds in narrow bands. The numbers were wrong for a clerical error, too precise, too balanced. Whoever assembled it knew exactly how many people they intended to feed and for how long. The subject line said only, "Emergency Contingency Provisioning, North Valley Intake Site." North Valley was not an intake site. North Valley Correctional was a decommissioned medium-security prison 7 miles outside town, half-stripped for salvage, maintained only enough to keep the pipes from bursting, and the state from getting sued if a teenager cut himself climbing the outer fence. I knew that because I had spent the better part of 2 years inside it after the closure. My name is Elias Van, and before the outbreak, I worked as a facilities transition coordinator for the State Property Division. It was a plain job with a long title. When the state shut down a school, prison, youth camp, treatment center, or administrative building. My office handled the years in between its last official use and whatever came next. Demolition, sale, storage, mothballing, environmental review. Sometimes nothing at all. I was the person who knew which boiler had been drained properly, which roof membrane still had 5 years in it, which substation needed monthly inspection, and which building had a backup well that nobody in the capital remembered because the paperwork lived in a binder from 1989. That sort of knowledge does not seem glamorous until everyone else starts forgetting how the world is physically held together. My work was mostly quiet. I drove a state pickup, wore work boots that looked more serious than my salary justified, and carried ring binders full of building plans under my arm from office to office. I walked vacant campuses and took meter readings. I arranged asbestos surveys. I made sure the fire suppression valves on dead buildings were either properly isolated or properly maintained. I filed reports full of sentences like East Dormitory remained structurally sound, though no longer fit for occupancy without window replacement, and emergency generator transfer switch, tested under supervised load, satisfactory. I liked it more than I ever expected to. Vacant buildings tell the truth in a way occupied ones rarely do. Without people decorating their failures, you notice what systems actually matter. Water, drainage, air, secure doors, sightlines, storage. A building stripped of ordinary life becomes simple enough to read. North Valley had been one of my sites. It sat on a low rise above the river flats, ringed by chain-link fence and secondary razor wire long since dulled by weather. Not a dramatic prison in the cinematic sense. No Gothic stone walls. No iron bars clanging in torchlight. It was a regional state facility built in phases from the late 60s through the mid-80s. Poured concrete housing blocks, central kitchen, clinic wing, laundry building, intake unit, maintenance sheds, motor pool, visitation annex, administration front, and a freestanding water tower painted a tired white that every bird in 3 counties seemed to favor. When the state closed it, most people assumed it would disappear quickly. But institutions are harder to erase than they are to build. The inmates left, the staff transferred or retired, furniture was auctioned, computers were removed. But the skeleton stayed. The kitchen still had floor drains, the yard lights still stood. The backup well still connected to the treatment room under Utility Block C. The perimeter still had 3 functioning vehicle gates, if you knew which panels had biwarower and which could be chained by hand. That was my business, knowing what still worked after everyone else had moved on. So when I saw that emergency provisioning email on Tuesday morning, I knew two things immediately. First, somebody higher up than my office was preparing to reuse North Valley in a hurry. Second, if they were provisioning food before they had even notified facilities, whatever they expected was closer than the public version allowed. I should explain the atmosphere of those days, because memory can make early warnings seem more obvious than they were. At the time, the outbreak did not yet feel like the end of anything. It felt like one more complicated emergency passing through the state's usual machinery of denial. Hospital overflow in the city, a neurological infection in 2 counties south, conflicting advisories about nighttime agitation, confusion, and behavioral instability among infected patients. The governor on television saying there was no need to disrupt ordinary routines. Schools discussing temporary closures, but not quite announcing them. Pharmacies short on sedatives and nitrile gloves. Emergency rooms restricting visitors after dark. On paper, none of that necessarily meant collapse. In practice, I had spent enough time around institutional planning to recognize contingency behavior when I saw it. Procurement always gets honest before public messaging does. Nobody orders industrial food stores, fuel drums, bedding pallets, and lock hardware for a mothballed prison because they are optimistic. By 8 that morning, I was in the district office in Canton, standing over the copier while building plans ran warm onto the output tray. My supervisor, Glenn, was on the phone upstairs saying variations of "yes, of course" to someone from emergency management. He had the strained politeness of a man who knows information is being withheld from him in increasingly expensive ways. At 9:30 he came down carrying his tie in one hand and said, "Elias, I need you at North Valley by noon." I assumed. "We're doing an accelerated readiness assessment." "For what use?" He looked at me a moment longer than necessary. "Temporary population holding." That was bureaucratic language, and I had spent too many years hearing it not to translate automatically. Temporary meant indefinite. Population meant human beings no one had appropriate placement for. Holding meant control had become more important than care. "How many?" I asked. "Unknown." "By when?" He checked his phone. "Possibly tonight." That answer was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of my job and started thinking in terms of my life. Not because I panicked. Panic is usually too disorganized to be useful. What I felt was correction, a quiet internal shift, like realizing you've been using the wrong scale on a map, and now all distances need to be recalculated. If the state thought it might need an abandoned prison operational by nightfall, then the public timeline was false. If the prison was being readied as a holding site, then hospitals, schools, and shelters were already on the edge of failing at their current tasks. And if the prison was the chosen fallback, that meant the most valuable thing in the county for the next few days would not be comfort or mobility. It would be secure structure. I drove to North Valley with the radio off. The day was mild for April. Thin sunlight, a little wind along the fields, roadside puddles still holding the memory of last week's rain. The prison rose out of the farmland in pieces as you approached it. First the water tower, then the outer fence, then the blocky concrete forms of housing units A through D behind the administration building. The whole place looked less menacing than unfinished, as though someone had intended to return after lunch and never did. At the front gate, a state trooper I did not recognize waved me through after checking my badge twice. That alone told me enough. Troopers weren't posted at closed facilities unless somebody expected the public to need keeping away. Inside, The place had already started waking up in the wrong order. 2 box trucks were being unloaded at central stores. A maintenance contractor I knew from another campus was prying plywood off intake windows. 3 National Guard vehicles stood near visitation. None of the men around them were moving dramatically. That was the unnerving part. Everyone was quiet, purposeful, focused on lists. It looked like storm preparation if you squinted and ignored the armed perimeter. I parked by administration and met Glenn in what had once been the records room. He had spread my old facility binders across a folding table alongside hastily printed incident briefs. A county emergency manager stood nearby with a woman from public health whose shoes were too clean for the site and whose face said she had not slept properly in 2 nights. "We need the usable portions of the campus by nightfall," Glenn said. "Water, sanitary, food prep, secure housing, clinic if possible." "How many staff?" "Whoever can get here." That's not an answer. It's the one I have. I looked at the plans. Then I looked at the incident brief lying upside down at the edge of the table. Even upside down, I could read enough. Nocturnal agitation. Door-focused behavior. Group destabilization in congregate shelters. Repeated perimeter compression after dusk. That was the first time I saw the phrase repeated perimeter compression, and I have thought about it often since. Such a calm term for a frightening thing. People infected during the second phase were not simply violent. They became persistent around enclosure. Fences, doors, loading docks, school entries, side corridors, ambulance bays. They drifted toward boundaries that suggested occupancy and stayed there longer than anyone wanted. Not charging, pressing, accumulating. Enough that a weak shelter could become functionally unusable just from constant human weight and noise at the margins. The public health woman noticed where I was looking and turned the brief face down. "What do you need?" she asked. "Time," I nearly said. But that is the one resource nobody can requisition honestly. Instead, I gave them an answer shaped by my actual expertise. "Don't use the whole prison," I said. "Use one controllable section and treat the rest as buffer. Housing block B, maybe B plus intake if you need overflow. Kitchen is still viable. Utility block C for water. Clinic wing only if someone confirms the oxygen lines aren't compromised. Lock down the inner yard, not the outer. If you light the whole campus, you'll spend the night defending empty space." She frowned. "We may need high capacity." "You don't have staff for high capacity. You barely have staff for layered control." Glenn gave me the look supervisors give when they need you to be both right and less obvious about it. The next hour, I walked the prison and confirmed what I already suspected. North Valley had not been maintained for comfort, but it had been maintained well enough to become something useful very quickly. The main kitchen could be brought back with propane and cold storage if power failed. The dry goods room still had steel shelving anchored to the floor. Housing block B had 2 tiers of cells with intact doors, functioning corridor lights on backup power, and a day room large enough for ration distribution without opening the whole unit. The old infirmary had running water and a generator-backed outlet bank, though half the exam rooms had been stripped. The laundry boilers were dead, which made that building less useful than I'd hoped, but the adjacent maintenance cage still held tools, chain, fuel cans, and 2 pallet jacks. Most important, the prison had its own water. A deep well, chlorination room, storage tank under the utility annex, and manual shut-off zones that allowed one block to be supplied while others stayed dry. That single fact made the whole place viable in a way schools and fairgrounds never could be. Municipal systems fail gracefully only while demand remains ordinary. After that, self-contained sites matter. By noon, I had a map in my notebook that mattered more to me than the official one on the table. not the operational plan for the state. Mine. The difference was simple. Their plan used North Valley as a temporary emergency holding site for a deteriorating county. My plan used North Valley as the one place in the county I understood well enough to survive inside after everyone else started improvising badly. That is the moral compromise at the center of the story, and I should be honest about it. I did not decide to save everyone. I did not even decide to help in some noble universal sense. I decided first not to be trapped in a collapsing public system when I could instead occupy a stronger one. Everything generous that followed came after that. It was around 1 in the afternoon, 48 hours before the outbreak truly declared itself in the open, that I made the practical shift from employee to planner. I kept doing my job, because doing my job gave me access and cover. But I began solving the prison for a different user group. Not hundreds of evacuees under state supervision. A small, disciplined population that could endure loss of grid power, reduced staffing, and prolonged pressure at the perimeter. That meant a different set of questions. Which doors can be secured without electricity? Which block can be heated most efficiently? Where do the roof drains back up? Which catwalk gives the best line of sight over the inner yard without exposing the shooter? No, not shooter. I corrected myself then. Because once you start telling the story in the wrong genre, you make bad decisions. Which catwalk gives the best visual coverage with minimal personnel? Which food stores are inside the most defensible section? How much potable water can be staged before everyone realizes water is the real asset? I spent the afternoon answering those questions while everyone else talked about intake flows. The prison's great advantage was not simply confinement, it was sequencing. One fence, then another. Vehicle gate, sally port, inner corridor, controlled block, cells if necessary. Thick doors between each stage. It was a building designed to absorb pressure in layers, which is the closest thing architecture offers to mercy under the wrong conditions. By 3, buses had begun arriving from county shelters. I watched the first one unload through the administration lobby glass. Elderly residents from an assisted living facility, mostly confused rather than ill, carrying blankets and pharmacy bags. They were followed by 2 deputies, a nurse, and a National Guard sergeant who looked at the empty detector arches and said, to nobody in particular, "Well, this feels like giving up." It wasn't, not yet. But it was a marker. The state spent the rest of the day converting North Valley into exactly the kind of overburdened emergency site I had feared. Cots in the gym annex, intake tables under fluorescent lights, volunteers trying to sort medication against bad records. Too many people entering through one administrative throat. Too much heat accumulating in spaces not designed for sleep. The whole place had the posture of an institution, pretending to be a shelter, while still thinking like a prison. The worst of both. I kept moving. I staged water drums in Block B. I checked the manual locks on the tier doors myself. I found the spare key cabinet, still hanging in control, and quietly set aside duplicates for the housing block, kitchen, infirmary, and utility annex. I rolled a pallet of canned fruit, powdered milk, and institutional cereal into storage near B's day room under the pretense of improving food distribution. I moved blankets, paper goods, and first aid supplies into the same corridor. I located the old hand-crank radios in maintenance, tested 3, and kept 2. If someone noticed I was concentrating assets into one section of the prison, they said nothing. Emergencies produce enough noise that well-organized selfishness can pass for efficiency. I left North Valley after dark, with a state-issued clipboard under my arm, and 2 truckloads worth of mental notes in my head. That evening, I did one more thing I am still not sure how to judge. I went to my sister's house. May lived in the north end of town with her daughter June, who was 8 and at that age where missing front teeth made every serious expression look temporary. May taught 3rd grade. She was practical in the way some tired mothers become practical, which is to say without interest in being praised for it. If I called her at dinner time and said, "Pack for 5 days and wear good shoes," she would ask one question, maybe 2, and then she would start packing. When I arrived, June was coloring at the kitchen table under the hanging light. May had the radio on low beside the sink and was portioning soup into glass containers because that was the sort of thing she did on Tuesdays, whether society was stable or not. "You look like a man who wants me to cancel tomorrow," she said. "Yes." "School already hinted." "This is more than school." She studied my face. "How much more?" "I need you at North Valley by tomorrow afternoon," I said. "Not the front, the maintenance gate on the West Service Road. Quietly. Enough clothes for a week. June's inhaler, all of them. Food if you have room. Tools, flashlights, warm bedding." June looked up from her drawing. "Why a prison?" "Because it already knows how to be crowded," I nearly said. "Because it has doors that still matter. Because the county is about to confuse open space with safety, and then regret it by the second night." Instead, I said, "Because I know it." May nodded once. She did not ask whether this was legal. That is one of the kindnesses siblings can offer each other in bad times. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said. "What about Mom?" Our mother lived 60 miles away in assisted housing and had already been moved twice that week under protective transfer language none of us trusted. Truth is, I had no good answer. We both knew it as soon as the question entered the kitchen. "I'm still trying," I said. That was also true, and not enough. I slept badly that night in my apartment with the radio on low and my boots by the bed. Around 2 in the morning, the station dropped normal programming and began cycling county advisories every 20 minutes. Remain indoors after dark. Report unusual behavior through emergency channels. Do not approach disoriented persons without support. Temporary closure of all public schools, effective immediately. It still sounded administrative even then. Administration is often the final language of denial. At dawn on Wednesday, 24 hours before the outbreak turned visible enough that nobody could politely minimize it anymore, I returned to North Valley and began the conversion in earnest. The state still believed it was preparing a holding site. I was preparing a fortress. Not in the medieval or heroic sense. I mean fortress in the practical, unsentimental sense. A place where the effort required to breach order is higher than the effort required to maintain it. That is all most real fortresses ever were. I started with reduction. People make bad emergency compounds by trying to hold too much. Too many entrances, too many rooms, too much perimeter, too many promises. A prison gives you the illusion that all enclosed space is yours just because walls exist. It isn't. Every extra corridor is another thing to monitor. Every lit window is a broadcast. Every unlocked outbuilding becomes an obligation. So I cut North Valley down in my mind until only the useful core remained. Block B for sleeping. Infirmary south rooms for medical and quiet space. Kitchen and dry stores. Utility annex and well room. One inner yard for exercise and daylight. One controlled route between them. Everything else would become sacrificial depth. By mid-morning, I had physically begun the same process. I shut fire doors and chained others open only where one person could supervise a long sightline. I stripped loose furniture from corridors that could become clutter or ladders. I moved wheeled cots out of B's lower tier so the day room made clear. I taped paper over unused windows on the inside, not for concealment yet, but to reduce the restless instinct people have to watch parking lots and make themselves part of every movement. I marked 3 sanitation rooms instead of 12 and shut the rest off at the water line to preserve pressure. I tested the gravity-fed emergency lighting in B and found it good for about 40 minutes if power failed, which told me how many battery lanterns to stage. By noon, the buses had stopped and private vehicles had started arriving. That shift mattered more than most of the staff realized. Institutional transfers are still part of a plan. Private arrivals mean the plan has entered rumor, and rumor always outruns capacity. Families came with plastic bags, coolers, pillows, photocopied prescriptions, oxygen tanks, cat carriers, lawn chairs, and the expression of people who have not yet accepted that nobody here truly knows what happens next. The line at intake reached the front steps. A deputy vomited into the landscaping mulch and then went back to sorting arrivals because there were too few deputies to spare him. Around 1, the first case in active medical distress was carried into the infirmary. Around 2, the county server connection failed, and the intake desk lost access to electronic records. Around 3, one of the volunteers asked me whether I knew where they had stored extra restraints. That question settled the matter for me more than any official announcement. A place asking for extra restraints on the second day of emergency intake is no longer imagining success. At 3:30 I took my lunch break, walked to the West Service lot, and met May there under a sky the color of old aluminum. She had done exactly what I expected. Practical bags, blankets in contractor sacks to keep them dry, June in boots, and a red knit cap, despite the mild weather, because May always dressed her one temperature ahead of worry. In the back seat, wedged between food bins, was my mother's old sewing basket for no reason I could understand, until May said, "Thread, needles, scissors, buttons. You'd be surprised." I let them in through the maintenance gate and took them not to intake, but straight through the vehicle tunnel behind the laundry building and into B block by the service corridor. Nobody stopped us. That is one of the things institutions do under strain. They stop distinguishing between sanctioned movement and confident movement. June looked up at the tiers of cells and said, in the same tone another child might use for an aquarium, "This is bigger than school." "It is," I said. "Do we have to sleep in jail?" "For now." She seemed to consider that, then nodded as if it were a temporary camping arrangement somebody else had already approved. I put May and June in 2 adjacent lower-tier cells near the officer station, where the doors still locked from the corridor, but could be propped for airflow. I chose lower tier because children and stairs become unnecessary complications as detented soon as people are tired. I chose cells because, stripped of their history, they offered something shelters almost never do: defined personal space and a door. That is another uncomfortable truth. Under the wrong conditions, confinement can feel gentler than exposure. By late afternoon, I had also made room for 2 other people I trusted enough to matter. Leon Barstow, a retired boiler mechanic who had worked North Valley in its final years and still knew which utility tunnels flooded first. And Darlene Pierce, a former corrections nurse whose husband had died before closure and who lived alone in a farmhouse too visible from the road to last long. Darlene came with 3 bins of clinic supplies, 1 case of glucose drinks, and the kind of calm face that makes everyone else believe there may still be categories available for their fear. I did not invite anyone else that day. If that sounds selective, it was. Selectivity is one of the costs of early preparation. By sunset, B block contained 9 people who belonged there, and more than 100 outside it, who did not know it existed yet as something separate from the larger prison. I did not enjoy that knowledge, but I used it. At 7:14 p.m., the grid failed for 32 seconds and returned weakly. At 7:46, the front intake doors were shut for the night and the parking lot lights flickered on. At 8:03, the first reports came over the guard radios of infected movement at the outer fence. Not attack, presence. A pair of figures drifting along the south perimeter near the vehicle sally port. Then 4 or 5 near the east administration fence line. Then more by the employee lot. The descriptions were all frustratingly similar. Slow, unstable, unresponsive to command, concentrating near lit areas, not dispersing. It was exactly the behavior pattern I had feared from the incident brief, and worse in one specific way. They were not targeting exits at random. They were orienting toward occupancy. Noise, light, heat, human density. North Valley, by trying to become a shelter quickly, had made itself legible. The staff at the front still thought in terms of keeping people out. I had already moved on to keeping pressure away from where we truly lived. At 8:30, I locked the B block service corridor and kept the key. Not forever. Just for the night. Just long enough to separate one functioning human scale from the larger panic building in the front half of the prison. That decision was the one I would later defend least easily if required to put it in official language. The main intake population still had staff, guards, medical oversight, and more resources than we did inside B. I wasn't abandoning them in the blunt sense. But I was choosing not to collapse our smaller, controlled system into theirs, merely because the larger one had greater moral visibility. There was no clean ethic for that. Only consequences. Inside B, I began routine. That may sound odd against the setting, but routine is what made the next weeks possible. Without it, the prison would have remained an emergency site, and emergency sites rot the mind faster than hunger does. We set breakfast for 6 a.m., while the kitchen still had dependable gas. Water fill and wash buckets by 7. Medical check for June's breathing, Leon's blood pressure, and Darlene's supply log by 8. Morning work blocks after that. Utility checks, scavenging, sanitation, bedding, food prep, corridor sweep, inventory. No one idle during the day unless illness required it. No open flame or cooking after dusk. Lights minimized after dark, then sectioned inward. Day room first, officer station second, cells last. May naturally took schooling in hand by the second morning, not school in the institutional sense, just order for June. Reading time, copywork, numbers. One-lined notebook becoming the day's shape. Darlene ran infirmary space and medication. Leon and I handled utilities, doors, water, generator, tools, food movement, and later the outer yard. June, to her visible satisfaction, became messenger, rag sorter, battery checker, and recorder of weather on a wall calendar she found in intake storage, still turned to a year nobody bothered correcting. The outbreak, meanwhile, became official in all the ways that matter least after it is already local. By Thursday morning, the state declared emergency infection zones across 5 counties. By noon, all remaining public schools closed indefinitely. By afternoon, the shelters nearest town had begun transferring people again because the infected pressed their perimeters through the night and staff could not rest. By evening, the rumor that North Valley was secure had spread far beyond any number we could responsibly hold. This was the true beginning of the prison's second life. All that day, vehicles arrived. Some turned away when the front lots filled. Others were admitted, processed, and bedded wherever floor space existed. The gym annex overflowed. Intake overflowed. Administration hallways overflowed. Guards started using old segregation rooms for those who became agitated after dark. Everything I had predicted about capacity and staffing came true faster than I would have liked, which is often how being right behaves in emergencies. It arrives without satisfaction. At dusk, Thursday, 48 hours after I first saw the freezer inventory, the outbreak became visible enough that even June understood it. We were in B's day room eating rice with canned chicken from compartment trays I'd scrounged from stores. The windows were papered, but sound travels through concrete differently than through homes. The outer prison had acquired a low, shifting human weight. Shouts from the front gate, a far-off car horn that did not stop when it should have, orders over a bullhorn, then no orders. Then, after full dark, a prolonged metallic rattling from somewhere near the administration walkway that made Leon pause with his spoon halfway up and say, "They've found the chain link." June looked at me. "Who?" she asked. I thought briefly about how adults lie to children in order to protect themselves from answering clearly. "People who are sick," I said, "and people who are scared of the sick." She accepted that for the night. Children are merciful that way. By Friday morning, the front of North Valley had become a failing system. Not breached, not yet. Just saturated. Too many arrivals. Too many exhausted staff. Too many patients who should have been somewhere clinical, but had landed inside correctional architecture because everything else had already begun to spill over. The infected did not swarm in a dramatic wall. They accumulated. They milled near fences, drifted under awnings, pressed into vehicle lanes, and stood too long by lit doors. Each individual case looked manageable. In aggregate, they made managing anything else impossible. That is how most institutional collapse actually looks. Not spectacular failure, attention starvation. Our answer inside B was to get smaller. I abandoned the idea of using the whole housing block. We consolidated to the lower tier plus one utility room and one corridor segment. I shut the upper tier entirely, chained the inner stair gate, and moved all sleeping to 8 cells in a row. I closed the secondary day room and turned it into food storage. I drained unused toilets to reduce smells and preserve water. Leon helped me isolate sections of the old radiant heat loop so we could warm only the cells we occupied if the nights turned cold. Darlene moved all medical into the nearest 2 cells and used the officer desk as triage. May turned one empty cell into a schoolroom/storage alcove where June could sit under better light and not confuse adult conversation for instruction. In other words, we took prison architecture and made it domestic by reducing its ambitions. That was the strangest emotional layer of the whole period. Cells are not meant to become bedrooms chosen by tired families. Officer stations are not meant to become libraries for an 8-year-old's math pages. A secure day room is not meant to smell like oatmeal and bleach and slightly damp wool blankets. Yet human beings are adaptable in morally awkward directions. Within 4 days, B Block no longer felt to us like the prison. It felt like our end of the building, our corridor, our sinks, our routine. Friday afternoon brought the first people at our locked service door. Not infected, survivors. 2 county road workers I recognized by face, if not name, had followed a maintenance route from the garage behind Motor Pool and found the B service corridor, because someone, perhaps one of the guards, perhaps one of the kitchen staff, had started directing reliable people toward quieter parts of the campus. They were exhausted, carrying a thermos and a tool bag between them, and one had a bandaged forearm. They asked politely if we had room. This was the second moral test, and a harder one than bringing in family. Resources are abstract until they have names standing in front of a locked door. I did not answer immediately. I asked questions. Where had they been? How many nights without proper sleep? Any fever? Any bites? The whole vocabulary of those days was still clumsy. We had not yet settled on stable terms. Darlene checked them under lantern light. May watched June from the schoolroom doorway, so she would not overhear the adult arithmetic in my face. In the end, I let them in. Not because I had space in some generous surplus sense, because both men knew county infrastructure. One had worked culverts and road barricades for 15 years. The other had heavy equipment experience and, more importantly, remembered the old quarry pit access beyond the west fence. Usefulness should not be the measure of human worth. In emergencies, it often becomes the measure of whether a group can afford to remain humane later. By Saturday, we were 12. By Sunday, 14. Not refugees from rumor. People filtered by root knowledge, recommendation, and plain practicality. A food service manager from the community college who understood inventory better than anyone I had ever met. A soft-spoken electrician named Huerta, whose wife had died in the city hospital, and who arrived carrying nothing but insulated tools and a photograph folded into a wallet sleeve. A sheriff's dispatcher with no field training and a perfect memory for call patterns, who, after 12 hours of sleep, helped me create a radio log cleaner than anything the front command post still had. This was when the prison truly became a fortress, and not merely because the perimeter held. Fortresses are not made by walls alone. They are made when people inside begin thinking in systems rather than episodes. We assigned every repeated task. We numbered water cans. We standardized meal times. We created 2 noise levels after dark, ordinary speech and emergency speech. We marked door statuses in grease pencil: open, latched, chained, no use. We tracked batteries on a board. We limited generator use to 1 hour every 3rd afternoon, enough to cool medicine, pump deep reserves, and recharge radios, never enough to make the whole campus feel electrically alive. We also changed the way we dealt with the outer prison. The front complex had not fallen, exactly, but it had ceased to be governable by people who expected ordinary compliance. By Sunday night, the National Guard had withdrawn from administration and consolidated near intake. By Monday, the gym annex was abandoned because infected pressure at the glass entry made sleep impossible, and 2 exhausted staff members had opened the wrong door, under the wrong voices. After that, the outer prison became what I had planned for from the start: sacrificial depth. We scavenged it carefully by day. Dry stores from kitchen, sheets and blankets from intake, medical carts from infirmary proper, cleaning chemicals, fuel, the old institutional mop buckets everyone laughs at until a real sanitation schedule matters, paper forms, clipboards, pencils, batteries, extension cords, a laminator nobody needed, but that May insisted on saving, because one day labels will matter again. At dusk, we withdrew to B and locked the service corridor. The infected never behaved like movie monsters at North Valley. That is part of why the place remains vivid to me. They were more difficult than monsters. They were predictable only at the wrong scale. Individuals wandered, paused, leaned, listened, drifted off, returned. In groups, they compressed toward heat, light, food odors, and the broad suggestion of occupied shelter. They did not need to be clever to become oppressive. The perimeter taught them enough. By the 2nd week, they had learned the front gate was noisy, the administration steps were warm in late afternoon, and the intake dock smelled of bleach, food waste, and people. That was useful, because while the front half of the prison continued telling the wrong story about where life was concentrated, we made B quieter, colder after dark, and harder to read. We sealed 2 window seams, rerouted cooking steam through an old laundry duct Leon reopened with more patience than seemed fair, and stopped moving through the inner yard during the last 2 hours of daylight. Huerta got one of the tower lights working on a manual switch, and we used it sparingly, only to draw attention toward the north fence during specific maintenance runs elsewhere. Everything about our survival came down to interpretation. Not fighting, not fleeing. Reading. When did the prison appear inhabited? From where? At what times? What sounds carried through concrete and chain link? Which smells lingered in cool weather? How long did stale bread from the kitchen dumpster keep the front lot interesting enough that the infected stayed there rather than exploring the service roads? If you dislike the word fortress because it sounds aggressive, think instead of a village built out of locks and sequence. That is what we had. The meaning of the place changed for me somewhere around the 18th day. It happened quietly. June had taped one of her drawings, a water tower with birds around it, to the inside of her cell door. May had found a blue institutional blanket and folded it the way our grandmother used to fold guest bedding at the lake cabin. Darlene was teaching one of the road workers how to check oxygen saturation with the pulse oximeter when the batteries behaved. From the day room, I could hear the low sound of people discussing soup rations without fear in their voices. Not optimism, just competence. I stood in the officer station looking out over the lower tier and realized we had turned a building made for punishment into a place governed mostly by consent. That did not absolve the structure of what it had been. The bars stayed bars. The doors stayed heavy. At night, when I walked the corridor with a lantern, there were still moments when the prison's original intention seemed to rise through the paint and watch us. But institutions do not own every future use equally. Sometimes, the most decent thing you can do with a bad structure is force it to shelter people better than it was ever meant to. The largest danger we faced did not come from a breach. It came from expansion. By the third week, word of North Valley as a viable site had spread beyond anyone we could trace. Not the details of B Block, thank God, but the wider notion that the prison still had power sometimes. Water likely, walls certainly, and people inside who had not yet died. That was enough. More vehicles began appearing at the outer gate. More shouted requests. More notes wired to fences. More desperate attempts to stay on site even after the front administration sections had been all but abandoned by formal staff. Some groups tried to camp outside the perimeter, assuming proximity itself was safety. That only made the outer pressure worse. Food smells, campfires, arguments, children crying, someone running a generator too long, infected gathering by night. The prison became its own weather system. This led to the most controlled but consequential event of the whole period. On a dry Thursday near sunset, a camp stove fire caught in one of the abandoned intake vestibules and climbed the old acoustic wall panels faster than anyone expected. We saw the smoke first from the B catwalk window, a pale column rising against the water tower, then thickening. Fire in a prison is dangerous, not because it spreads magically, but because every corridor decision around it costs time. We had, by then, 14 people inside B, and enough water to attempt intervention without sacrificing ourselves if we were careful. I made the decision in under 10 seconds. Not to save the front complex. It was already too compromised and too visible. To prevent the fire from making the whole campus unlivable. Leon, Huerta, and I took extinguishers, masks, pry bars, and the utility cart through the maintenance corridor, while Darlene kept everyone else inside. Be sealed and ready to isolate against smoke. The front of the prison was louder than I had heard it in days. Metal clatter, far-off shouting, the directional confusion fire always causes in crowds. But the actual fire was still small enough to be treated as a building problem rather than an apocalypse. Huerta killed local power to the intake wing, so the alarm panel stopped chirping nonsense. Leon shut the interior smoke doors by hand. I used the old standpipe hose from administration, praying the pressure would hold, and feeling absurdly grateful when it did. We never saw a single cinematic horde. We saw flickers of movement through smoke-hazed glass, shapes crossing the lot beyond the fence, people running the wrong direction, because emergency geometry is harder to read in low light. Inside the intake vestibule, the fire consumed paper signage, plastic seating, and one wall panel before we got a controlled stream on it. The real threat was smoke, tracking into the connecting corridor, which would have advertised fresh human movement and warmth through half the campus if left unmanaged. We kept it contained. 42 minutes from first smoke to final hotspot by my watch. No speeches. No heroics. Only work. When we came back to B, smelling of wet ash and old insulation, June was asleep on 2 chairs pushed together in the day room because waiting had worn her out. May put a mug of hot broth in my hand without asking whether I wanted it. That gesture, more than the fire, is what I remember. After that, our fortress changed again. We accepted that North Valley could not remain merely our shelter. It had become a landmark, whether we wanted that or not. So rather than pretending secrecy still existed, we shifted to management. We created an outer advice board at the west service fence, posted only by day, listing 3 things. Water not available here after dusk. No campfires within fence line. Follow County Road 16 west to Quarry Spur for safer overnight tree cover. Was the Quarry Spur truly safer? Safer than the prison perimeter after dark? Yes. Not safe in the moral sense, but directional truth is a form of mercy if all certainties are gone. We also began trading information rather than refuge whenever possible. Route notes, well locations, which churches still had intact kitchens, which farms had cisterns, which school shelters to avoid because their gym doors turned into pressure points after dusk. In that way, our prison stopped being only a fortress and became something more complicated, a hard, uncomfortable source of order. Months later, when the seasons changed and the outer lots grew quiet enough for weeds to push through cracks undisturbed, I often thought about the freezer inventory that started it all. 600 pounds of rice, powdered eggs, institutional oatmeal. A quiet admission hidden in procurement language that somebody somewhere expected ordinary life to fail on schedule. They were right about the failure and wrong about the schedule. Outbreaks do not happen when the announcement says they do. They happen when enough small systems stop believing in each other at the same time. Water delivery, staff sleep, door supervision, medication continuity, school closure, fuel, record access, the willingness of one tired volunteer to keep telling frightened people no. Once those begin slipping, the rest is just geography and structure. By autumn, North Valley had settled into a rhythm I would never have guessed possible in those first 48 hours. We no longer used the word fortress much. The building did not need the drama of it. It had become, simply, where we lived. May taught 6 children most mornings in what used to be classification. June lost the rest of her front teeth and laughed through the gap like it was a useful improvement. Darlene turned the infirmary supply room into the cleanest, best-labeled space in 3 counties. Huerta coaxed steady, limited power out of systems I would have written off in any formal report. Leon died in late November, quietly, after 3 weeks of pretending he was merely tired, and we buried him beyond the north fence, where the ground stayed drier and the water tower could be seen through winter branches. I still did rounds. I checked hinges, drains, seals, fuel, inventory, weatherproofing, Vent louvers, frost cracks, and roof lines. That part never stopped. I do not think people like me are built for endings anyway, only continuations with better notes. Sometimes I walked the outer administration hall in daylight, long after the urgent pressure had moved elsewhere, and saw the old intake desk, the chipped floor tile, the faded institutional paint, the places where panic and bureaucracy had briefly occupied the same square footage. And I would think, with no triumph at all, that I had not survived because I was harder than anyone else. I survived because my entire adult life had taught me how buildings fail, and more importantly, how they can be reduced to what still matters before failure becomes total. That is the part people usually miss when they hear the title. They imagine the conversion as something sudden. A man boarding windows, hauling crates, becoming important in a montage. It was not like that. I converted an abandoned prison into a fortress the same way I had always done my work, by reading plans carefully, identifying viable systems, narrowing the field responsibility, and refusing to waste resources on space that only flattered the imagination. 2 days before the outbreak became undeniable, I saw an honest spreadsheet. I recognized what sort of future it implied. Then I went to the one place in the county already built to outlast a certain kind of human pressure. Everything after that was only maintenance and choice, and the difficult work of letting other people into a structure without letting the structure decide what kind of people we would be inside it. These days, when the evening light hits the water tower and turns it the color of bone, the prison looks less like a monument than a utility again, which is what it always should have been. Not a symbol, not a legend, just a hard, practical place that kept enough order around a small number of lives for those lives to continue becoming themselves. That is the only kind of ending I trust. Not victory, not rescue, just a door that still closes properly, a water system that answers when called, a child doing arithmetic under institution-grade lighting, and a building with a bad history being made, day by day, to serve a better one. Had intact kitchens, which farms had cisterns, which school shelters to avoid because their gym doors turned into pressure points after dusk. In that way, our prison stopped being only a fortress and became something more complicated, a hard, uncomfortable source of order. Months later, when the seasons changed and the outer lots grew quiet enough for weeds to push through cracks undisturbed, I often thought about the freezer inventory that started it all. 600 pounds of rice, powdered eggs, institutional oatmeal. A quiet admission hidden in procurement language that somebody somewhere expected ordinary life to fail on schedule. They were right about the failure and wrong about the schedule. Outbreaks do not happen when the announcement says they do. They happen when enough small systems stop believing in each other at the same time. Water delivery, staff sleep, door supervision, medication continuity, school closure, fuel, record access, the willingness of one tired volunteer to keep telling frightened people no. Once those begin slipping, the rest is just geography and structure. By autumn, North Valley had settled into a rhythm I would never have guessed possible in those first 48 hours. We no longer used the word fortress much. The building did not need the drama of it. It had become, simply, where we lived. May taught 6 children most mornings in what used to be classification. June lost the rest of her front teeth and laughed through the gap like it was a useful improvement. Darlene turned the infirmary supply room into the cleanest, best-labeled space in 3 counties. Huerta coaxed steady limited power out of systems I would have written off in any formal report. Leon died in late November, quietly, after 3 weeks of pretending he was merely tired, and we buried him beyond the north fence, where the ground stayed drier and the water tower could be seen through winter branches. I still did rounds. I checked hinges, drains, seals, fuel, inventory, weatherproofing, vent louvers, frost cracks, and roof lines. That part never stopped. I do not think people like me are built for endings anyway, only continuations with better notes. Sometimes I walked the outer administration hall in daylight, long after the urgent pressure had moved elsewhere, and saw the old intake desk, the chipped floor tile, the faded institutional paint, the places where panic and bureaucracy had briefly occupied the same square footage. And I would think, with no triumph at all, that I had not survived because I was harder than anyone else. I survived because my entire adult life had taught me how buildings fail, and more importantly, how they can be reduced to what still matters before failure becomes total. That is the part people usually miss when they hear the title. They imagine the conversion as something sudden. A man boarding windows, hauling crates, becoming important in a montage. It was not like that. I converted an abandoned prison into a fortress the same way I had always done my work, by reading plans carefully, identifying viable systems, narrowing the field responsibility, and refusing to waste resources on space that only flattered the imagination. 2 days before the outbreak became undeniable, I saw an honest spreadsheet. I recognized what sort of future it implied. Then I went to the one place in the county already built to outlast a certain kind of human pressure. Everything after that was only maintenance and choice, and the difficult work of letting other people into a structure without letting the structure decide what kind of people we would be inside it. These days, when the evening light hits the water tower and turns it the color of bone, the prison looks less like a monument than a utility again, which is what it always should have been. Not a symbol, not a legend, just a hard, practical place that kept enough order around a small number of lives for those lives to continue becoming themselves. That is the only kind of ending I trust. Not victory, not rescue, just a door that still closes properly, a water system that answers when called, a child doing arithmetic under institution-grade lighting, and a building with a bad history being made, day by day, to serve a better one